Hey everyone, it's Erin with Counter Read. I am joined by Brandon, also of Counter Read, and we are here to recap Nebraska, Michigan, and the fact that Nebraska continues to not have a home. To be clear, home, how do I want to say this? Nebraska continued its streak of not being shut out at home. It's clear, I have to be clear on that because I don't want people to think shut out in general, but it had been since 1968 and Nebraska did not tack that did not end that streak essentially in 2023. Take from that what you will, everyone. But Brandon, how are you?
I'm doing well. It was, at a point fairly early in the third quarter is when I started asking that question of like, is that what we've got to watch here? Is the shutout streak? And I remember well, there have been Nebraska games in the past where I've gone back and looked up to make sure that 1996 was the last time that Nebraska was shut out, which in fact it was. The Arizona State game, which I remember very well as a sophomore in high school. And but the home question is one that I hadn't had to look up in a while, and went back and did that, and it was indeed 1968. That was one of those two kind of like meh years for Bob Devaney, and ended up winning a national title 2 years later at Nebraska. But it would have been injury on top of insult, I guess, if that streak had snapped. And it's not like it's any great solace otherwise, but at least it's something. So Nebraska did avoided it on a legitimate touchdown. Like, got it on a big play. Yeah, Michigan's backups were in there, but so were some of Nebraska's. I think we'll talk about one specifically that wasn't eventually. But yeah, you don't want to get shut out. Let's put it
No,
that
so
way.
when you're saying the legitimate shutout piece of it, one thing that a lot of people brought up is the last time Nebraska got, I would say, pretty close to being shut out, but then ended up basically tacking on points within the last 33 seconds of the game was Oklahoma, Nebraska, 2004. Nebraska ended up losing that game 30-3, was going to be shut out, but Bill Callahan marched the ball down the field and was able to kick a uh, well, sorry, I was about to say very, very incorrect. Basically, was able to kick a
A
field goal.
600-yard field goal.
The whole play itself was 66 yards. Now I was like, that would be groundbreaking, and we would be talking very differently about that. Basically, what I am saying to everyone who's watching this video is this has been one of those games where I feel like my brain is mush now. That is where I'm at because I have been looking at the stat sheet, and I'm not even really quite sure what I want to make of it. I will say the one quote that stood out for me for one of the quotes that stood out for me from Rhule post game was when he said, "You hate these kind of moments, but you can't waste these kind of moments." And I know at the end of the day, words are words. You need to see that put into action. But I do appreciate that he's basically saying, this really sucked. He said that literally. This was not fun. But you have a choice now, and that is to either do nothing with that and try to shove it out of the back of your mind and move on, or you can actually do something with it and learn from it. I would say listening to him, he is in a different place, obviously, than the players are. Rhule has been through this before at Baylor and Temple. The players definitely came in a lot more emotional. You could see it in Isaac Gifford, especially. He was very, you could just tell he was not that I expect any of them to feel great, but he was taking this very personally. The defense, which I admittedly had said in our game day guide, should have held its own. I think everyone coming into this expected Nebraska's defense to hold its own against Michigan to at least a certain degree. And so I think for a lot of people like Isaac Gifford, this was a bit of a shock to the system that so much was breaking down. And yeah, they were without some key players. But at the same time, you can't really make excuses. It needs to be next man up. And unfortunately, overall, the defense just wasn't able to do that.
Yeah, they weren't, which was surprising to me as well. Like, I knew Nebraska wasn't going to put up the numbers it had put up all season against the number two team in the country. But you hope and you think if you're a Nebraska fan that it'll be sort of a stalemate for the most part of like, yeah, you're going to bump our average up, but we're also going to bump your average down. Um, and that wasn't what this was, and it was surprising to me. And I would add to that, to what you said, that I think Rhule's in a different spot than a good portion of the fan base too. Like, I think he does a good job of trying to understand like the pain. Um, and Nebraska fans have lived it through different coaching regimes, but each time you have a new one, kind of hope springs anew, right? So you hope the first season is going to be something out of nowhere and like it's going to be wildly successful. And it's hard to just to keep to wait. I mean, it's hard to wait for anything in general, particularly today. Um, but when you add sort of, on the TV broadcast today, they threw up a comparison of Michigan from 1997 and Nebraska when they split a national title, and Michigan's got 6 conference titles, Nebraska's got 1. Um, I can't remember what the other categories were. I think they were bowl slash BCS appearances, and there was one other one that I'm forgetting. Doesn't matter. Nebraska fans have been through a lot, and it's hard. It's okay to believe in Rhule and what you're seeing and what they're doing, and still be anxious to have a game that gives you some real hope, because you had to do a lot of reading between the lines. And I thought Saturday against Michigan, like, I think Michigan's real good, and I think they're even better after watching them today. But I thought Saturday had the chance for one of those games that you see sometimes in new coaching tenures, especially the ones that end up successful, where you're just kind of out of nowhere. It's like, yeah, we're going to play out of our minds, and we're going to challenge a team that we have no business challenging. And the Rhule quote that stuck out to me, and I don't have the full one, I was jotting it down by hand. He talked about cutting loose, and I think that's what it is. Like, you see a team just come out and play with kind of nothing to lose. Auburn kind of did it, ended up losing to Georgia today. But that's a program under a first-year head coach. And we haven't seen that for quite a while in Nebraska. And I could talk about this for a long time. I won't, because I'm planning to write about it this week at counterread.com. But it's just, I think there's always that hope, even with a game where Nebraska is at a significant disadvantage, and everybody agrees on that. You always have the hope that maybe this time it's going to be one of those games that if Nebraska's not into it, not playing in it, you flip to when you're watching games on college football. You're like, oh, Kansas is about to beat Texas. Let's see what happens. Happened in 2021. It definitively did not happen today.
Yeah, and I'm going to parlay this into one of the questions we received. So if you are not familiar with Counterread, head to counterread.com for subscribers this week, and this will move to paid subscribers, but this week it was open to all subscribers, both free and paid. But we opened up a game day chat, and it was really, really great to hear from everyone and just kind of talk through what we were seeing as the game itself was going on. And one of the questions after the game came from a user his username is 8-bit acrylic, and he basically wanted to know, was this game lopsided more because of Michigan as a program, or Nebraska? Basically, is Michigan that good, or is Nebraska that bad, or is there more nuance to it? And I've sat and thought about this question quite a bit, because Rhule brought it up post game, where he's like, in these moments you have to, he kept saying the word holistic. He's like, it's not just one thing. We're going to have to go out and recruit. We're going to have to make the players we have better. We're going to have to scheme better. We are going to have to do just everything better. And he's like, we have recruits on the sideline, so hopefully they see, hey, I could come here and make a difference right away. But he's like, it's more than that. If you're only banking on recruiting, you're not scheming, you're not making the players that you have better. And the reality is, Nebraska, the talent level of Nebraska is just not where Michigan is right now. So that's that recruiting piece of it. So when we talk about that question of, is Michigan that good? The answer is yes. Is Nebraska that bad? I would say the answer is no, because the nuance to it is that, in my opinion at least, yes, Michigan, which Rhule kept saying is the number 2 team in the country. There's a reason they are where they are. They're very, very good. Jim Harbaugh and his group are very good. Nebraska, though, to sum it up, is like just being that bad would, I think, be doing a disservice to what this actually is. Yes, talent level wise, Nebraska is not matching up with Michigan right now. However, to that point of playing loose, this is a team that, if it could play a little bit more loose and free, probably would be able to maybe make things a little bit more interesting, because they do have players that can maybe surprise if they just don't feel so limited by what they're doing. And you could go, well, who's limiting them? And honestly, it could be a number of things: past coaching staffs, current coaching staff, like it, previous experience, current experience. There's so many pieces that go into that. But I think it would also be, when Rhule brings up recruiting, I think it would be a mistake, which is why he is very careful with this, to basically imply that he has a roster that's not talented, because he does have talent on this roster. There is talent there, but it's going to have to be developed. But at the same time, it's not at the same place that Michigan is right now. So again, I say Michigan, yes, is that good. Nebraska is not that bad, but there's just a whole lot of layers to that onion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Nebraska, I think right now needs to close a talent gap on a lot of teams. And I'm well aware, and it's kind of the best measure we have to do this. Like, you can pull the past 5 years of recruiting rankings, et cetera, and say, well, Nebraska is, or really what you're saying is, should be, based on the quality we thought of the recruits, the most talented team in the West. And I think they're still close to that. The thing that's interesting to me about Rhule is the gap he's trying to close in the West Division, which is going away after this year, which is another big topic for a longer discussion at a later date, is more of the execution piece of that. Michigan, as the number 2 team in the country, basically asks you to be perfect. And, I wrote in the game preview this week, my number 1 key was be within a touchdown at halftime. And Nebraska was down 28-0. It didn't have to be 28-0. And I wrote a little bit about this in our chat that you mentioned for Counter Read subscribers. But that's not everybody watching this, so I'll mention it again here. Like, there's just, we're used to Nebraska playing Iowa, Wisconsin, Northwestern when it was really humming. And those teams really do a good job of putting the question to you of, can you execute better than us? What Michigan does, because it's the second most talented team in the conference, is it basically asks you to be pretty close to perfect. And so you look at that first Michigan touchdown. In my view, that ball should have been intercepted like at least 20% of the time, probably broken up another 75%. So that just leaves a 5% chance that that play ends at a touchdown. That's just me like spitballing it. Like, there's no real numbers there. That's just my opinion. And that's what it ended up. It ended up a touchdown. Okay, so you're down 7-0. You get an interception on your opening drive. That's the kind of play you just can't make. You give up the next touchdown on a 3rd down. It was 3rd and 1. So maybe not that big of a deal, but that 4th and 1 play is one where I think it really illustrated for me where Nebraska football is at right now, because there was no doubt in my mind, and there was a timeout before that play, so we had a lot of time to think about it. Like, there was no question that I thought, you got to go for a touchdown, because sure, it'd be nice to get on the board and take a field goal, but you're not going to beat Michigan with field goals. So they went for it. I knew if they tried to run it, I had very little confidence at that point that Nebraska would pick it up. So it's like, what do? You could run some play action, You basically have to finesse around the fact that you can't, with good confidence, say, we're just going to beat Michigan and get this 1 yard. And so that's kind of where they're at. And there was a couple of other, on that ensuing drive. So Michigan took over inside the 15. Nebraska defense did a good job. Already down 14-0, forced it to 3rd and 7, didn't get off the field on it. like you just can't miss that many plays early. I don't know what I'll come up with a name for this like hypothesis at some point later in the year, but when you're a 17-point underdog, you got to give the favorite a little bit of doubt, I think, early on to prevent this game from just unfolding like it should unfold based on the point spread. And Nebraska had some opportunities and it just missed on them. So, you look at those just 3 or 4 plays that I mentioned, if you change 2 of them, like maybe it's a little bit different. It wasn't. Nebraska's not quite there yet, or maybe it just missed those plays on this specific day.
Well, Rhule did bring up the 4th and 1 with Harburg, and I actually want to circle back to that really quick before we get to the next question I do want to ask from our chat. But somebody did bring up in our video from last week where they said to me that I was missing a piece about the whole conversation on Heinrich Harburg, and that his experience was essentially, now this was post Louisiana Tech, they're saying that his experience was like essentially 0. And you're not wrong. Yes, this was his 3rd start against Michigan, but this is somebody who is learning in the moment, really, really big moments, and is having to kind of figure things out. So speaking about that 4th and 1, for example, now Rhule said when he's done watching film, maybe he'll feel differently, but at least in the moment, what he thought he saw from it was that if Heinrich would have maybe not reacted quite like he did and tried to maybe jump and could have really essentially reached for it, like he felt based on what they had seen from Michigan that the play itself was drawn up to provide success for Nebraska to get that first down. Obviously, you wouldn't call it if you didn't think that it didn't have a potential of success. But he thought, he was not putting blame on Heinrich. I want to be clear here. He wasn't saying like, oh, Harburg would have just, he was like, this is a moment where this is a quarterback who is learning in the big moments. And at that particular moment, maybe just didn't respond in the way that he would have the next time he sees that playing out in front of him. And yeah, a little bit of it is like Heinrich's also playing behind an offensive line where he's not getting a ton of help from his tackles. Like he's also doing a lot with not a lot of support in front of him. The offensive line has been hit or miss in some areas, definitely better in some areas more than others. He doesn't have consistent playmakers at wide receiver, or really, and I shouldn't even say it running back, because I also think a little bit of that is they haven't been truly trying to get the running game going. At least Satterfield doesn't feel like he has been. So some of it is like, yeah, if you're Heinrich being presented with this 4th and 1 situation and you are looking at the Michigan defense, the entire defense coming right for you, you may have had the ability to stretch your arm out and get that. But, if you're not feeling confident in that moment, you can see how maybe that would play out. Again, Rhule said once he watches it, he might feel differently, but that was kind of where he was at, was like, this is a young quarterback learning in the moment, which has its challenges. So with that said, one of the people, and I believe it was Erin, yes, Aaron, Erin asked, after all is said and done, have you seen growth so far since last year? And I will throw this back to you, but I will give a really quick answer on my side. I would say yes in some areas, and not even necessarily no in others because of like regression or anything. It's just more or less like some areas are just what they are. Like the reason I say that is like receivers, you had a Trey Palmer in 2022 who really was the star of the show. You've had like in the past the Austin Allens, the Vogel who were able to kind of be a guarantee for the quarterback. That hasn't really panned out yet for Nebraska on the offensive side. Yeah, we're seeing some areas where Billy Kemp is, doing well, Fedoni as well. Marcus Washington had that giant play, which was key to keeping things, just momentum going. But I would say he doesn't have that player yet that he's connected with. And because of that, I don't want to say like it's worse or better or anything. It just is. But aside from what you saw against Michigan, the defense is still improved. The tackling is still better. I do think that the defense can learn a lot from what it saw. Rhule himself said they saw like one of the top rushing, like they saw one of like the top running teams, like one of the, like the defense now has seen this, a team that can really run the ball and now can go back and learn from that. Defense, I do still think is improved from last year, but I think overall it's probably too early to say what, in my opinion, growth there is. But, you know, this many games in, there's some areas where you can go, yeah, it's looking better-ish.
Yeah, for me, I don't think there's much doubt for me that they're improved. I really think they are. The offense has obviously regressed, and so if you think about this from like a 2 or 3 years down the road perspective, which, you know, I was talking about earlier, like I understand that's not easy to do. That's a luxury that Matt Rhule has that most fans don't get to experience. But like, does Nebraska have its quarterback of the next 2 to 3 years on the roster? Maybe, I guess, if depending on how you feel about Harburg. But in some ways, like, they knew going into the season that probably wasn't the option. That's why you bring in a transfer quarterback. At wide receiver, the last 2 years, Nebraska has done really well in Samori Toure and then Trey Palmer with addressing a real need in the transfer.
I'm glad that you brought up Samori. Can't forget him. Can't miss him.
This year, they essentially opted not to do that with the type of receivers that they brought in. So that remains an issue. O-line, it's always the hardest one to parse, but I so far haven't seen a ton there that says, oh yeah, like it's improved over a year ago. All that said, Nebraska's 2-3. Their 3 losses were as underdogs. Now, Colorado was a really slight underdog. That's basically a toss-up. Minnesota was pretty close. In Minnesota, I hope Nebraska gets to the end of the season without being haunted by that Minnesota game, because it's a game they should have won. And, like, you know, everybody watching this watch that game and, you know, can feel however they feel about it. But, like, Nebraska did really well in that game. This was the first time against the best team that they've played that they haven't really been in a game at halftime. So that, to me, marks a little bit of progress, not because that wasn't the case previously, but I think there's kind of a changing mindset that, you know, you have to read between the lines a little bit to see. And I do see that. It's hard to prove with any like concrete information, but that's just kind of my take on it. Like, defensively, the progress has been easy to see, and it's not even a splashy defense. Did they end up forcing a turnover today? I don't think they did, but they'd forced one in each game previously, and that's nice. You'll take one, but like, rocket fuel for getting a new coaching job off the ground quickly is going way positive in turnovers, which every coach wants to do it. It's just really hard to do, actually. It's really hard to control. So they're playing really good defense without being, it doesn't feel false anyway, if that makes sense to me. So at this point, I would say, even after today, there's no doubt in my mind that they're better. And I think at the end of the year, it'll become easier to see that. But right now, you're 2-3, and like, bowl eligibility probably didn't include going 2-3 when you were just penciling things out in the off season. That's certainly not how I had it. So it's fair to expect some consternation, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yes, and just a couple of quick updates before we let everyone go. I think it's important to just note these things. Matt Rhule did give a couple of updates on some injuries. Good eye by some people pregame. I hadn't even been looking for him, but Liebenritt he had hurt his elbow against Louisiana Tech. That's why he didn't play. Singleton, his situation was unclear to Rhule as the game was ending, but they do know it's a knee situation. Obviously, he has to go through all of the everything to figure out how severe that is. So he wasn't able to provide much on that. The one that was more concerning than anything else was that Luke Reimer, which the update we had been given on Thursday was that he was expected to play against Michigan. Everything was on track for him. Unfortunately, it seems things took a turn for the worse. He had to leave the team hotel early Saturday morning. So this morning, depending on when you're watching this, he was taken to the hospital. Rhule did say that was out of like an abundance of caution. He just was feeling really terrible. So he mentioned an infection, some antibiotics, but didn't give really, anything specific. So he just asked people to keep him in their thoughts and prayers as he recovers from what took him to the hospital. And so he was not at the game. So that was, just something to keep in mind, that he wasn't even in the stadium today. I had to clarify because I thought I had seen him, but I was mistaken. And again, like in Rhule's case, he's like, well, if he would have come back, from the hospital, he wouldn't have necessarily known that he was back. But no, he was not. He is still going to be recovering. So hopefully we will have an update on that soon. But for those who are like, wait a second, I thought we were told on Thursday that he was expected to play. What happened? Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worst. I do also just want to reply to one quick thing too on YouTube, because we do read your comments. Somebody made a comment that it was, the way that they called it is that it was ballsy of me to say that the Payne fans in the stadium were sleepy. And I want to be clear on something. The fans were never sleepy last week, nor would I imply that even today as fans left. It was 95 degrees and they were baking in the sun in a game that was a shutout until nearly the end. I was not in saying that, and I want to be clear on that. I was talking about the game day experience as a whole and how the university and how Nebraska itself sets up the game day experience for its fans, which Trev Alberts talked about when we were going through all of the potential updates to the stadium with these new renovations. So they understand that. That is what I was calling sleepy, not the fans. And if that was ever implied for those of you that are paying hard-earned money for this, please understand that I was not implying that about you. It's more about the experience you are or are not given when you are in Memorial Stadium. That's what I was talking about. So yeah, it was, it's going to be a short, interesting week. And we will have plenty to come at Counter Read. So before we let you go, Brandon, do you have any quick final thoughts?
I just have one question for you.
Yes.
What do you make of Jeff Sims not getting in this game? Michigan played 4 quarterbacks. It's never a good sign when your opponent plays 4 quarterbacks just because they want to, of course. Nebraska could have played multiple quarterbacks and did not. And I'm not a QB controversy guy. Like, I'm not trying to stir the pot, but it caught my eye this time.
Yeah, I would say the fact that Jeff Sims didn't come up post game from Rhule probably says more than anything else. He was very, high on talking about Heinrich and focusing there. Obviously, we know that the situation with Jeff Sims, as we were told, is a high ankle sprain. Those can take a while to fully recover from. You definitely don't want to put somebody out there. We learned watching Adrian Martinez and other people who had these high ankle sprains try to play through them, that it doesn't get better trying to play through them. There's only so much tape that you can put on someone's ankle before it just simply does not work any longer. But I do think at some point when you're not seeing him at all, especially as things were getting more, and the reason I bring this up, actually, I'm glad you brought it up, and the reason that I feel this way is pre-game, Jeff Sims was slotted into the backup position for the first time in 3 weeks. The last 2 weeks, he was warming up as the number 3 quarterback. Today, he warmed up as the number 2 quarterback. So it felt like, maybe we'll actually see a little bit of Jeff Sims again, and then we didn't. So it tells me that Heinrich Harburg is Nebraska's starting quarterback, and that for whatever reason going forward, Jeff Sims will only be available if needed. Could be completely wrong. I just think at this point, you are rolling with Harburg. And I think the way that Rhule talked about it post-game, I think the way that things have just progressed, it's just the gut feeling I have at this point.
Yeah, I think it's possible because, we heard multiple coaches say this week that, Sims isn't at 100% yet. which, with the way you said it, you're like, he must be like 90 then. Maybe he's not. Maybe that's all that this is. But even so, he made it into the game because he was needed to last week. And at this point, I'm going to need something to prove to me that I'm wrong on this, which I'm wrong a lot. And if I am, so it is. Like, I feel like Harburg's their guy. Like, he's their starter going forward. That's kind of what no other quarterback, even if Sims was a little, was less than 100%, like, you still put a backup quarterback in there in a game where you're trailing by 5 touchdowns for a good stretch. So it was interesting. And I think, with how Matt Rhule used his timeouts at the end, and he talked a little bit about that in his press conference, they were like trying to use these as teachable moments for a young quarterback. Like, today was probably the best evidence yet that I think they think right now that Harburg is their best chance to win games going forward. And yes, and I'll throw this in as somebody mentioned it in the chat. As rough as today was, and as surprising as today was for reasons I mentioned at the top, like, Nebraska still got a chance to win a good amount of games. It just played the best team it's probably going to see all year. And now it gets into the heart of the Big Ten West play. And in those kind of games, like, I think you'll take your shots against what Nebraska's going to see. And it was interesting. Matt Rhule, who's pretty reserved and pretty balanced and fair, kind of took a walk-off moment at the press conference, I thought, with just how he ended things, of like saying everybody in Nebraska, is going to wonder about this team all week. And like, he's like, we'll see on Friday how they play against Illinois.
Well, the good news is you will be in Illinois. So for anyone who's wondering, we will have Counter Read in Illinois with all the nitro cold brew and everything that they have on tap. And they do give beer post game. So win or lose, you have that to look forward to. But we will be there. Brandon will be there, and we will give you all the updates throughout the week. We are planning a full week of content at Counter Read, as we always are. So head to counterread.com, become a subscriber. Even if you just started as a free subscriber, we hope to earn your trust and tell just some really good stories, but also provide really good information through. So with that, we are going to let you go for another week. Thank you as always. We read your comments, so thank you for leaving comments. Even when you tell me, hey, that was a bonkers thing of you to say, look. We'll talk it out in the comments. Brandon, thank you as always. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.